There are a lot of things science still can't explain. Gravity, that weird protrusion in my mouth, the birth of the universe, it's all complicated stuff, I tell ya. But today we're going to dive into the creepier side of the unexplained, such as unknown creatures and nightmarish specters. This episode is bound to be full of your worst nightmares. Better yet, they're alleged to be true by the people who sent them to me. So enjoy these allegedly true scary stories about encounters with the unexplained. And if you'd rather listen to the stories I narrate on the go or while you sleep, search for the Darkness Prevails podcast on Spotify and on iTunes. And if you got a moment, leave us an honest review on iTunes too. Thank you. And if you want your story narrated on the show, share it with us at darkstories.org. All true and scary experiences are welcome there. But I'd especially love some stories about caves. Now then, let's begin. Full Moon from R. Stevenson. A few years back, I found myself in a set of circumstances that led to an unfortunate accident. Nothing too serious, but what happened after that has forever changed the way I think. I was driving home from the hospital a town over because my mom had cancer, so I'd been spending as much time with her as possible. She has since passed on, God rest her soul. The drive home often took me about 80 or so minutes, so it was a bit of a lengthy drive. On this particular night, the drive was pretty dreadful. Along with a light downpour, there was some very thick fog. It was so bad that visibility was nearly zero. I was driving around 30 on a 50-mile-per-hour road, and I still felt like I was going too fast. Add on top of that how tired I was, as it was around 2:20 a.m., and you've got yourself a recipe for a mild disaster. I ended up banking too hard to the right around a corner, slamming the front of my car into a rather thick oak tree. It was scary to say the least, and my car was banged up pretty bad. It's amazing how much damage only 30 miles per hour can do. I wasn't hurting or anything, and I didn't think anything was broken. I wasn't sure if dialing 911 was appropriate, so instead I dialed my local sheriff's office, informing them of where I'd crashed. They replied letting me know that they'd be sending a cruiser out soon. When I asked if they could give me a lift, they didn't really reply directly to that question. Assuming that I shouldn't expect them to give me a ride, I also called my brother, who said he'd be there in about half an hour. So I was alone in my car, which wouldn't start, on a cold, rainy, and foggy night. After sitting for a few minutes, I threw on my coat, which had been sitting in the passenger seat. Then I went for the door handle. The idea was to get some fresh air and to check my whole body to make sure I wasn't injured somewhere. After that, I could get a full view of my damaged car. But when I turned to the left, towards the driver's side door, I stopped, and I found myself unable to continue opening the door. A massive sense of dread welled up in me. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was holding my breath as I watched out the window. That night was a full moon, so while I couldn't see past the fog, I could very well see the silhouette inside it, standing alone on the empty road. From the outline, it appeared to be a man, but oddly enough, he was just standing there, either facing away from my car or facing towards it. And for the next 5 minutes that I watched him, he didn't move. Not to walk, not to shift, not to breathe, not to itch. He didn't move at all. I stared at this human shape, trying to make sense of it, and I was beginning to convince myself that this wasn't a person at all. It must be something just human-shaped. A statue, a scarecrow, possibly some lawn ornament that had fallen out of someone's vehicle just right. If it was a statue or scarecrow, why was it in the middle of the road? No matter what excuse I came up with, it still didn't make enough sense for me. Even so, I could not find the courage to open that door. Instead, I had the idea to crack the window and to call out for the man in the road. Maybe they needed help. I lowered the window, which miraculously still worked. I guess the battery was still hooked up and functioning in the car. I only lowered the glass about 1 inch. I didn't want some psycho to be able to reach in. Something just didn't feel right about this situation. I raised up my face, preparing myself to shout through the small opening. But before I could, I heard a voice that was not my own. It was like this pained sigh, distressed and confused and traumatized all rolled into one. The sound made me tremble. My skin became gooseflesh. It was the most horrible sound I'd ever heard, and along with fear, a feeling of sadness overwhelmed me. I watched out the window as the figure began to move. Slowly the silhouette lowered itself, kneeling upon the ground. When his bottom sat on the road, he began to lower his back until he was just lying there, just as motionless as before. Then, as if on cue, the fog began to fade away rapidly. In a mere 30 seconds, I was able to make out the man lying in the road clear as day, thanks to the sheer brightness of the full moon. What I saw when I looked at the man made me gasp. My eyes were met with a crimson shimmer. Every inch of the man's body seemed to glisten and sparkle under the moonlight because the surface of his skin was wet, every inch of it moist with some sort of substance that was a bit thicker than water, a red substance. It didn't take long for me to realize that, good God, the man had no skin. The entire front half of his body appeared to be sanded down, and as I looked upon his fleshy visage, I soon saw the road behind him. A visceral, wet trail of red led up to his body for several dozen meters, as if the man had been dragged over the road, his skin filed down and grated by the asphalt. I wanted to vomit. I prayed I would see headlights coming in the distance from either direction, but I was alone, and I was alone there for the next half hour, because my brother was late, and the police officer was much later than him. And as I sat alone in my car for the next half hour, too afraid to even reach over to touch the door to roll the window back up, all I could hear was more and more moans and sighs of absolute pain. I felt as if I was going mad. This had to be a nightmare. I reminded myself repeatedly that I must have been knocked unconscious during the crash, or at the very least, I had some sort of severe concussion. I stared straight ahead through the somehow intact windshield, finding some semblance of distraction in the pattern of the bark of the oak tree that I'd hit. Eventually, the moaning died down at around the same time that headlights began to appear in the distance, swallowing up the shadows of the turn, and even then, I had no courage to look to the left, because I was horrified at the thought of seeing that man in the road. I must have lost track of time then, because the next thing I remember was someone tapping on the glass.
Sir? Sir, are you okay?
A tired-looking police officer was at my window. I lowered it the rest of the way for him, and I nodded profusely. He asked to see my driver's license and insurance, as well as my registration. Everything was in order. He then tested my blood alcohol levels, even though I told him I had not been drinking. I was out of the car at that point, doing as he told me. I kept trying to force myself to look in the direction of the road to see if the man was still there. Finally, I did. I glanced over. The road was completely clear. The man and the stain on the road, all of it was gone, and I felt even more insane. The officer filed a report and my brother came to pick me up. Everything turned out fine in the end. and I never did get an explanation as to what I saw that night. But I have an idea. I wasn't the first or only person who has had an accident on that road, and mine was far from the most severe. I think what I saw was a victim of that road. Someone who had crashed just before they rounded the corner. Their body launched through the windshield, sliding across the road, where they would ultimately perish. When I get the chance, I'll be sure to look up the town records. Who knows? Maybe I'll find proof that an accident like that did in fact happen on that very road. Meaning what I saw that night was the remnant of a tortured, tormented soul. A Strange Encounter from RJ Timberwolf. Let me start by saying that I'm both a skeptic and a believer. As a certain paranormal investigator said, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. I'm not going to plead with anyone to believe me. That's your own decision, since I'm skeptical of a lot of other people's stories. I live in South Africa. Growing up at a certain stage, our family was poor, and things like fast food were a luxury that only happened about 4 times per year, if we were lucky. My father worked for a mine as an investigator, and as such we were allowed to reside on a mine-owned plot, 15 kilometers, or 9.32 miles, from the nearest town. There were only 2 neighboring plots and a groundskeeper for the plots that resided in a type of servant quarters on our premises. The house we resided in had some creepy areas, namely the dining room, living room, and the front entrance hall, all one big open plan area. Things never felt right there, and sometimes it would feel like someone or something might even be watching you. Thus, we kept the hallway door leading to that area permanently closed. As a footnote, it was always dark or shady in that area of the house, even though we had lightly colored drapes and furniture and huge windows. Before then, I only had some paranormal encounters as a baby and toddler. Now I was a 12-year-old boy and could barely remember them. Thus, I did not really believe in ghosts, and always took other people's tales as nothing more than stories. But I digress. On this particular evening, my parents went to town to buy fast food for us. Obediently, I took a bath, and like most people, I believe, I like a steaming hot bath with the door and windows closed. At some stage, as I was lying in the bath soaking up the heat, the water and air in the bathroom started to cool drastically. For some reason, I had the sensation that I should look behind me, where the towel rack and door were located. First, I saw a washcloth lift off of the rail, as if someone had taken it by the sides and lifted it. When it got to about 5 centimeters or 2 inches above the rail, it dropped to the floor. The same repeated with the towel. I jumped out of the bath and ran to the imagined safety of my bed, still naked and wet. I don't know how it came to be, whether I fell asleep or passed out, but I awoke as my parents unlocked the back door. Here's the part that I do not have an answer for even today. I was dressed. My bed was wet where I'd laid. The bathwater was warm and both the towel and washcloth lie on the floor. I don't know how I got dressed or if the paranormal activity had anything to do with it. We later found out that the daughter of 2 residential families before us had allegedly practiced black magic in the living room, thus leading to their eviction. Don't know if it had anything to do with it, but you never know. Little did I know that that would not be my last paranormal encounter. Creature in the Closet from Nina W. I live in Limburg. That is the most southern province of the Netherlands. I'm 20 years old, and all my life I've been wanting to work as a caretaker for people with a disability. Just a few months ago, my dream came true. and now I work as a full-time caretaker at a living facility in Maastricht. At this facility, my story takes place. The living facility is positioned just outside of Maastricht City. Before the building became a housing facility, it was a laundromat for the people living on that street. The facility consists of 3 houses that are internally connected. Each one can house 8 people. That makes a total of 24 patients that live in the facility. Each patient has his or her own room, ranging from small to large, to a separate bathroom and kitchen, to a shared bathroom in the hallway. I first began working at this facility when I was just 17 years old, as an intern for my education. The story starts 2 years ago, when one of my patients that had lived there for 3 years moved out to live at another facility. His family claimed that the patient did not feel safe in his room, because he would hear knocking coming from his closet. We made our apologies for the inconvenience, but didn't think much of it. 1 month later, when the room was cleaned and disinfected, a new patient came to live in the empty room. It was an elderly man, who I'll just refer to as Rick. Rick was a warm and kind-hearted man who always loved talking about horses that he had as a child, as well as his great love for Russian opera. You'd always catch him sneaking into the kitchen to get a snack or hear him sing opera. I must admit, he had quite a powerful and wonderful voice. At first, he would bid us a good night before he went to bed. But as time went by, Rick seemed more and more distressed. He didn't eat and didn't drink as much as he used to, and he lost weight at a troubling rate. He would sit quietly on the couch, staring blankly at nothing. When asked what was wrong, he would say that he had a terrible nightmare of some kind of creature lurking in his closet. My colleagues and I debated whether or not he could be getting Alzheimer's and would need testing for it. He had been tested, but nothing came out of those tests. Every night, Rick would scream us awake, and when we came into the room, he'd be sitting on his bed, trembling and pointing at the closet. He'd say that something crawled out of the closet and joined him in his bed. He described this creature as being skinny, even bony, with rotting meat hanging from its bones. The creature had green eyes, the same color as his deceased mother, and huge fingers that ended in claws. The creature's face was that of a human skull, those green eyes being nothing more than small lights, and a mouth that was filled with sharp teeth, like a crocodile. The creature would lie next to him in his bed, wrapping its claws around his body. Rick described so vividly how he could smell the horrible scent of decay as the creature opened his mouth to whisper in his ear, "Get out! This is not your home." Rick would cover his ears as he said that, and he would soil himself. Poor Rick. My colleague checked the closet, but there was nothing there, and the only thing we could say was that everything was going to be fine. Fast forward about a month later, and Rick would wake up with markings all over his body, deep scratches that appeared to be claw marks. There were even bite marks that were deeper and more animalistic than any human bite. Rick would not want to go into his room anymore, and he would bring his dinner to his room and place it at the door of his closet. My colleagues would take the food away, much to Rick's horror. He'd say that we would make the creature angry, and if it was angry, it would punish him. I feel so sorry for him, especially seeing the fear in his eyes as we scolded him and took away the plate. There was 2 weeks of this, the same thing happening with Rick. One of my closest colleagues and I were working the night shift one night. We were making our usual rounds, checking if everyone was sleeping and all the machinery was still up and running. That was when we heard a horrible, bone-chilling scream echo through the building. The scream came from Rick's room. We stormed in, throwing the door open hard, revealing a horrible sight. Rick was lying on his back in his bed while he was grasping for air. He was clawing at his neck and chest, ripping the flesh off, making bloody gashes all over his upper body. His bed and himself were covered in blood, and there was a trace of blood leading to his closet, which was now slightly opened. My colleagues dialed 112. That's the emergency line in the Netherlands. While I desperately tried to stop Rick from clawing, the only thing Rick did was scream, as if possessed, and stared at the ceiling. After what seemed like forever, the ambulance came and took Rick away. A week later, we received the sad news that Rick had died. The room once again was left empty. The blood was cleaned up by a cleaning company and the room would be occupied soon enough. But even before the room was occupied, I found another patient standing in the room in front of that closet. "Hey, what are you doing in here?" I asked her as I walked into the room. The patient had stared at me and had muttered,
"This room should not be occupied ever again. It is angering him."
Who's him?" I asked with a shaky voice.
"You know who I mean. The devil who lived in the closet."
After she said that, she walked out of the room and left me breathless. 2 weeks later, that same patient moved into the room. I don't know why she was placed in that room, but I do know that she too changed. She can't remember her own name now, and all she does is sit in front of that closet, talking to the devil. I don't know what's going on at my work, but strange things keep happening. Colleagues tell stories of hearing footsteps in the hallways. Others hear whispers in the garden, and one even claimed to have been attacked by a shadow demon. Whatever's going on, one thing is for sure. The creature in the closet is real, and he's not happy about our patient living in his room. The Beast at the Window, from Bill 6928. This happened a very long time ago. I'm currently 54 years old, and I was 28 when this happened. It all began when I was driving home from the north of the state, trying to get down south back to my family. A 4 to 5 hour drive really was taking it out of me, and I needed to catch up on sleep. I pulled over to the side of the road. I'd barely seen any cars and figured a few hours of sleep wouldn't do any harm. I soon found myself dozing off to the quietness in the truck. I woke up around 3 a.m. Something had been hitting something in the nearby forest. It sounded like someone beating a steel bat against a tree. It really put me on edge. I had never heard animals make such a sound before. I'd hunted many times and seen a lot of animals, so I tried going back to sleep. Eventually, I woke up around an hour later to find something had hit my car door. I felt the entire car shake, and I nearly had a heart attack. Looking around to see what was there, I noticed a foggy breathing. The type of breathing you do when it's cold, and you can see your breath. This fog was rising every few seconds above my passenger window. It seemed as if someone or something was on the other side. And me being paranoid, I tried to lower myself down on the seat. Now, with my body flattened on the seat, I could see something looking in. I wasn't sure if it saw me yet, but I could see it drooling. It seemed to have a wolf-like head. Its muzzle covered my window in a smudge of saliva. It was pressing itself against the window hard, and the animal was panting, as if it had run miles to get to my car, and it appeared to be shaking, as if it were angry at me. Not the kind of scared shaking, the kind of "I want to beat the life out of you" shaking. I guess it hadn't seen me yet, because soon it left. I got up, watching it walk back into the woods. I was shocked to see it was walking on only 2 legs. These legs were not the legs of a wolf or canine, not even those of a man, but the legs of an elk or deer. Had it not been for the moonlight, I wouldn't have been able to see it. After it was far gone, I sped off back home, shaking constantly the entire way. When I got home, I ran inside, locked the doors, and grabbed my .45 handgun, which was all I had at the time for protection. A very basic gun, but it would keep me safe. I hunkered down for the night, keeping my gun close. The next morning, I went to see that my car had a huge dent in the side of it, like that beast had thrown a bowling ball at it, full force. My car door was totaled, and I could not open it with the handle on the passenger side. I have no idea what that thing was, but I've learned to never go down that road again. Skinwalker of Holbrook, South Carolina, from LuWulfhardt. I was driving around my friend's old neighborhood, keeping an eye on the place, as it is quite the hotspot for unnatural occurrences. One such instance is when he and I were walking down his street one night. The sun was setting, and the evening breeze glided through the trees. There was a peaceful, yet heavy and suffocating surreality in the atmosphere. Just as a shiver went up my back, my friend turned to the edge of the woods, and I followed suit soon after. As if on cue, a man's yell, painful and full of agony, broke the eerie serenity of the evening. Now on edge, we hasten our pace and walk hurriedly. His home was just about 10 minutes from where we were, but anything could happen between here and there if we weren't careful. About 5 minutes away from his home, another yell boomed from the woods. Only this time, it's altered from before, becoming more and more animalistic as it's dragged on. We increased our pace again, the daylight almost completely gone, and after what felt like an hour, we finally made it to his front porch. That's when we heard it. Behind us, in the woodline, there was a screech, an awful combination of a rooster's crow, a goat's bleat, and a dog's bark. After that, whatever it was, it hissed and began moving towards us quickly. The leaves in the trees rustled as it got nearer and nearer, jumping down from the branches and into the brush of the bushes and smaller foliage. We heard it land on the ground, and soon after, it came crashing towards us, stopping just before it broke out of the wood's cover. Whatever it was, it began breathing heavily. Then it pointed a bony, clawed finger out of the brush at us, curling it in a motion as if to tempt us to come nearer to it. Not too long after, my friend unlocked his door and swung it open. Both of us stumbled inside, then we slammed the door shut behind us. Right as we did, whatever that thing was slammed up against it and tried to break it down, if not at the very least frighten us. It then sounded as if it jumped from his porch and back into a tree, dashing back into the woods. Later on that night, we heard some occasional scratching, as well as tapping on the windows and other parts of the house. But we didn't bother to open the blinds or investigate for obvious reasons. Thankfully, we had the pleasure to not see what the rest of it looked like, but we did have the misfortune of hearing it scream. That's just one of the many uncomfortable yet equally exciting experiences we've had together. If you want to investigate the area, be sure to visit Holbrook, South Carolina. That particular neighborhood was a quaint and quiet little place. Unfortunately, most of it has been deforested for housing development. But that doesn't exactly restrain any odd things from occurring. Just be on your guard and stay safe.